Well, I'm delighted to be here, and Denny called me a couple weeks ago and made me aware of what was going on. And I feel I want to be very open. I'm not going to bore you with PowerPoint slides. This is only the second presentation I've ever given. But the first one had PowerPoint slides, and I kind of have gone away from that. Because what I'd really like to do is have a conversation. And that's because we, as members of the transportation, logistics, and supply chain space, are to a certain extent at a historic level. At a historic level, and that's not just because of what happened in COVID, but it's because the supply chain is firmly ensconced in the corporate boardrooms. To give you an idea just how much it's in there, I've been very active in an organization, Young Presidents Organization, for several years, and I know some of you have said, you don't look so young. So we are in the YPO Gold area, which is when you turn 50, you get promoted to YPO Gold. And I've been very active in the group for 30 plus years, was on their international board. I just got done chairing a network called the Manufacturing Excellence Network, and that has about 4,300 members. Well, 2 weeks ago, I was asked to put together a webcast for the UPS Teamster situation. With about 7 days, 8 days notice, yesterday we had 155 presidents and CEOs and people sign up for that webcast. I want you to think about that. A couple of months ago, I was talking to a CEO out of Miami, and he said, Mike, let me explain how my world has changed. And I was like, okay. He said, 3 years ago, I might have spent 3 to 4% of my time on supply chain issues. He said, today, it's 65 to 70% of my time are tied up on supply chain issues. And as members of the transportation community, and the Chicago Traffic Club is one of the most venerable clubs in the entire United States, that's an enormous opportunity for us, but simultaneously is a challenge. So I happen to serve on the board of a publicly traded carrier, Universal Logistics. Our chairman, Matthew Maroon, also happens to own Central. But because of that, and I've been very active in different industry associations, we're very fortunate to be able to know and interact with several of the leaders of trucking companies, truckload and LTL. If you go to TranzAct.com, you can see our on-the-record interviews. So people like Derek Leathers, people like Rob Estes, people like the Pitt, Ohio, I could go on and on and on. But one of the things that I found particularly interesting was I was talking to the leader of a very significant LTL company, and he made an observation. And this was 6, 7 weeks ago. He said, Mike, he's in his early 70s. He said, I've been in trucking my entire life, and I have never witnessed what we are witnessing today. And when I asked him to kind of unplug that for me, and he said, strategically here at our organization, we're watching 4 things very closely, because make no mistake about it, these 4 things will impact the LTL market. And one of them was UPS, the Teamster contract with UPS. And I was kind of curious, how does that impact the LTL industry? He said that's going to be an indication of what the compensation level is going to look like over the next 4 to 5 years. Said that's interesting. He said we're also, this was right after the announcement was made about ABF. And he, ABF is a Teamster organization. And he said then we have the T-Force agreement. And he said then we're all watching yellow. And let me just tell you, that poses a challenge for me. you need to know that when Yellow was going through its ups and downs and the volatility, I was a Yellow champion. And I had some carriers ask me, somewhat jokingly, I think, is Yellow paying you? I spoke at the Wolf Conference and I said, quoting Mark Twain, the rumors of my death are premature. But today, we are at a situation where when Denny and I were talking, it is real serious. And I think every one of you that's in the industry knew that before you walked into this room. Now, some of the issues that I think you need to understand involve how did we get here? And, we started TranzAct in 1984. Before that, I was at the Bank of America in their audit and payment section. Before that, I was at Price Waterhouse for 4 years, primarily auditing transportation companies, because my first job out of college was with the Union Pacific Corporation, okay? And I was an internal auditor. And some of you are going to say, Mike, I need some take-home value from this particular session so I can justify it. And so you all know what an internal auditor is. That is somebody who walks around and stabs the wounded after the war is over. Today they're known as IRS auditors. But anyway, I shouldn't say that. Denny said, we need to make this politically free. But anyway, so I've been in the business a lot of years, and, going back, so you need to know this, I've been very familiar with Yellow, going back to when George Powell III was the CEO. There was a legendary guy that named Newton Graves, was a mentor to me. And Newton, people said they wanted to be Newton because Newton golfed a lot. Somebody said, no, you want to be his golf bag. That golf bag has been on hundreds of the finest courses around. Newton is now 94, and I just talked to Newton about 4 weeks ago. And so we went from George Powell to Bill Zollers to James Welsh. Today we have Darren Hawkins. I've interviewed Darren. He's been part of at CSCMP, NASSTRAC, on the records. So we have tracked Yellow. And so what I'd like to just share with you in the how did we get here, it's important to take a look at where the industry has been, where it's at today, and where it's likely to be in the future. If you go back to 1995, what happened in 1995? ABF bought Carolina Freightways. Okay? If I go to 2001, what happened in 2001? FedEx buys American Freightways. I knew Sheridan Garrison very well. He unfortunately had an early, passed away in an accident and all. But that put FedEx firmly in the FedEx Freight, the LTL business. Then what happened in 2002? In 2002, Consolidated Freightways went under. I want you to think about something. They were the third largest LTL carrier, and they were doing about $2.1 billion in revenues. And I want you to lock and load on that number, because it's going to come up again when we talk towards the end about what happens if. Now, 2002 was momentous because Yellow buys Roadway. That Roadway, for a lot of people, are surprised when you hear Roadway was actually the number one LTL carrier. Yellow was number two. If you took a look, and I remember this very well, because we were running our Freedom Logistics program, and full disclosure, we launched that in 95. Yellow's been a valued member of that network, along with 29 other LTL carriers since then. And so if you take a look, Yellow and Roadway coming together, they were going to have synergies, and they were going to have, take out cost, and it was, a giant kumbaya moment, except they forgot to factor in one thing. these were two great competitors. And I've been to Israel, and I jokingly say, you know, coming out of Israel, you realize that the Israelis and the Palestinians and the Islamic groups, they don't like each other. But for the sake of the kids, they say, we'll try and get along. And I knew a lot of roadway people. Some of them were legendary leaders. I knew James Staley, you know, the CEO of Roadway, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And I knew a lot of yellow people. And we came under the tent, and we were supposed to be one organization, but culturally, they weren't. And we had yellow terminals in roadway terminals. And the cost efficiencies that Bill had anticipated getting with that acquisition were slow to materialize and never materialized to the extent that it was supposed to have been. And that's a very important factor, because they tried to play nice with each other, but they were clearly overlapping. Now, I've been blessed with several mentors, and one of them was a gentleman, Bob Buford, who was like Peter Drucker's son, the son that Drucker never had. And so we had the opportunity to meet Peter Drucker on a couple of occasions. And Peter Drucker had a famous quote, "Culture will eat strategy for lunch every single day." You had two different cultures. Now, fast forward. What happened in 2005? Yellow buys USF, US Freightways. Coincidentally, a guy that I worked with at Price Waterhouse was the executive chairman of USF at that time. And I said, "Paul, how did you do that?" And he kind of winked and said, you know, it was a praise God moment. Because I had spoken at a financial analyst conference where we were talking about the issue that US Freightways was having. They owned a carrier called Red Star on the East Coast. Red Star had a horrific union issue to the point where USF one time just said, "We'll shut it down." Now, with that acquisition of USF, Yellow picked up some very prominent regional carriers, two of which were Holland and Reddaway. At the time of the acquisition in 2005, Yellow was purportedly going to be employing 70,000 workers and have revenues of $9 billion. Today, Yellow is, I think, I might be wrong, 5.2 billion, in that range. What happened? Well, once again, Bill was saying, this is our lucky day again. Not only did we buy Roadway, but we now bought another LTL carrier, and it's off to the races. But the cost cuts that they had anticipated getting, they didn't get. And on top of that, they had now not two disparate cultures. I now have multiple cultures. And I can say we're all part of the YRC family. And you know, like I said, because I have so many friends within the Yellow network, these men and women, to me, are operating under heroic circumstances. And I will simply tell you that because of that, now I have arguably, you know, the Teamsters. You can go through the ups and downs of the Teamsters. They were vital to Yellow's survival a couple years ago when Yellow put them on the board. Yellow's had, you know, arguably some ups and downs. And the Teamsters, you know, soldiered it. But we always had these work rules which created an operating inefficiency. How many of my trailers can go on intermodal? What are the responsibilities of the drivers? And once again, I want to be very transparent. You know, because I do know some of the senior leadership at Yellow. When Yellow, you know, James was there, kind of stabilized it, James Walsh, And then we move into Darren, who's been at Yellow for a lot of years, and candidly, I think sees the issues quite clearly. Quite clearly. What has to happen for Yellow to survive? But along the line, some other things happened which had a huge impact. UPS buys Overnight. Overnight was owned by a gentleman there, was vociferously against the union organization of that carrier. UPS buys Overnight, rolls them in under the Overnight banner, and proudly operates at a 98% operating ratio until they were bought by T-Force a couple of years ago. Now, what UPS did, and I don't have the year for this, and I apologize, they bought their way out of the Central States Pension Fund. So they no longer had to make a contribution to the Teamsters Pension Fund. And that leaves in the LTL space, I might be off here, but I don't think I'm off by much. Someone, you may want to correct me, leaves primarily Yellow and ABF as the two contributors to the pension fund. That pension fund, as well as the welfare and health fund of the Teamsters, is a big deal. Now, how does this all spiral down? Well, we have a situation where we've got disparate cultures wanting to get together under one banner, and we have a carrier that's stuck with a redundant network. And what I mean by redundant network, Yellow has, I believe this number is right, 300 terminals, and under the One Yellow initiative, wants to reduce 24 of those terminals. Those terminals are worth a lot of money, folks. I'm on the board of Universal Logistics. I saw it in April. Obviously, I couldn't say anything. We just bought the Compton, California Yellow Terminal for $80 million. Why do these terminals have value? Well, you know, Central now is building a state-of-the-art facility at where the Yellow Terminal used to be on 95th Street. And one of the things that we're going to talk about here briefly, and I want to make sure, Denny, I honor the time, is, you know, people are looking at the LTL industry that really don't understand the LTL industry. And they're making some comments that basically tell us that they are woefully uninformed about what drives the industry. I'm a CPA. My wife's a CPA. I worked for a real accounting firm, Pricewaterhouse. She worked for Pete Marwick, KPMG. We're going to edit this out if we get a video. I'm only kidding, okay? Both big accounting firms. But I can read balance sheets. I can read income statements. We go through at TranzAct when we do our Freedom Logistics. You know, we ask the carriers routinely to share with us the operating ratio information, not because we want to hammer it with them. We want to understand what's driving their cost, so that we can go back to the shippers and say, you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing this. Well, here's where we're at now. The Biden administration basically threw a lifeline to the Central States with a significant payment to the pension fund. They also, under the CARES Act, gave Yellow a loan for $700 million. Now, a lot of people said, well, you know, how could you not survive if you get a 700 loan? Where did Yellow have to put a sizable portion of those funds? Into the pension fund. Not only into the pension fund, but they also needed new equipment. So we're looking at a Yellow today that basically has valuable assets sitting in a redundant terminal network, coupled with equipment, coupled with 3 regional carriers. And correct me if I'm wrong here, I've been a little bit confused, but I call the long haul Yellow YRC. Okay, that to me is the national brand there. But when we take a look now at what the financial analysts have looked at, And I probably shouldn't say this, but I will say it. If you're reading the FreightWaves articles, Craig Fuller, he ought to apologize. He comes from a trucking family. It's not like that trucking family had the secret sauce. Eric, his brother, ran U.S. Express. He had to sell U.S. Express. So I love it when Craig writes in FreightWaves, pontificates about all the issues about Yellow. All the financial analysts are saying, can Yellow survive? Yellow survive. And what it has created a vortex in a potential death spiral. Because what happened now last week? And when this happened, I called Denny and I said, Denny, do you still want me to speak? Denny and I are friends for a long time, and we can talk with each other. What happened before last weekend was Yellow filed a $137 million lawsuit against the Teamsters, claiming they were not negotiating in good faith. If I back it up before then, when Yellow launched the One Yellow initiative, they started out with Redaway. It came off well. They then came into Holland territory, and we hit the brakes. And so the union has basically, as you read FreightWaves and the other stuff, it's not just the closure of the terminals, which will result in a loss of jobs. It's also a transition of responsibilities for some of their drivers where they are converted to what's known as utility drivers. Yellow drivers make $36, $37 an hour, but under this utility role, what do I do on the dock and some of the issues? It's not an easy situation. But from my vantage point, and I have to be careful here because my personal opinion may trump my professional opinion. We are dealing now with a company that clearly recognizes what has to happen in order for them to survive. Concurrent with that, if I can just divert your attention for a little bit, we need to talk about the re-emergence of the Teamsters. Now, everyone in this room, most likely, and for you scholarship students, you should maybe want to study this in college, know the name Sean O'Brien. When you see the president of the Teamsters at a Senate hearing telling a sitting U.S. senator from Oklahoma that he's a greedy CEO and he needs to shut his big mouth, we are traversing new territory in contract negotiations. Now, they have said UPS was their target. There are those that suggest, whether it's true or not, Yellow will be their sacrificial lamb. And that is horrific. But you need to know, Sean O'Brien felt like the contract that UPS negotiated in 2018 was an awful contract that should never have been accepted. And we did this webcast yesterday, and Jerry Hempstead, who's a dear friend of mine, gave all the reasons. And Sean O'Brien came in and said, we're going for beer. Not B-E-E-R, B-E-A-R. And so he has basically, if you read the Teamster stuff, UPS was pleading with the Teamsters. They got agreement on the 55 supplemental agreements. And there's all sorts of reason why Carol Tomei is in the midst of this negotiations. But at the same time, we've got the Teamsters opposing Yellow. Now, what Yellow had to do in their negotiations, Sean O'Brien let it be known about 5 weeks ago in a video that he should have never leaked, that Yellow basically told them, if you don't agree to these One Yellow initiatives, we're going to run out of cash in the end of August. Well, what happens is Yellow, in their negotiations and in their lawsuit, purportedly said, no, we may run out of cash by the middle of July. Now, it's a very dicey situation with no clear line of sight. But what is really telling, Yellow, they got the $80 million. It immediately went to pay off, reduce their debt, I think, which is $1.5 billion or something like that. And they have acknowledged the liquidity issue, so they did not make a $50 million payment to the Teamsters Fund this past weekend. The Teamsters announced, I believe this is correct, anyone jump in if I'm wrong, come July 24th, if that payment has not been made, they will strike Yellow. Now, I have to just share with you, is it bluff or bluster? We don't know. But what Sean O'Brien is looking at is not just UPS, it is the reemergence in the re-engagement of the Teamster movement itself. He has made it clear that as soon as the UPS negotiations are done, we're going to go after Amazon. He's also made it clear that the Teamsters ought to go after the gig workers, which would be Uber, Lyft drivers, and people like that. He has also made it be known that there's other competitor to UPS, I think their name is FedEx. FedEx is not unionized. And he's holding up this model contract with UPS as his incentive to say, come with us. Now, what does that have to do with Yellow? Yellow has a competitive wage structure. The Teamsters, they get the benefit of the Teamsters agreement. And Sean basically puts out a tombstone 4 weeks ago with Yellow's name on it. Now, my marketing directors here, I called that one of the most classless and crass acts. It got struck from our 2-minute warning. But it wasn't constructive. And what Yellow is doing, in my opinion, is recognizing this is how we have to operate if we are going to be a Teamster carrier that has an ability to serve our customers. And, I know there are Yellow representatives here, and if I'm, afterwards, if I'm misleading here, but you take a look at the Yellow network, and you see where Holland has terminals, and you see where Yellow has terminals. If Yellow is right, there's 24 terminals that they don't need. And having said that, if we don't need them, they're not in a financial position to carry them just to save jobs that Yellow has deemed are not necessary. And so that's where we're at today. Now, the challenging news becomes, what do shippers hate most of all, in my opinion? Anyone want a little hooksters? You want to volunteer which shippers hate most of all? Disruption. Disruption and uncertainty. So now, I'm a shipper, and I say, what if there's a strike on the 24th? Do I want to put my freight into a network that I may not get delivered? Now, having said that, let me switch gears and talk about something really important. And that's why I personally hope and why I believe shippers and, interestingly enough, LTL carriers are pulling for Yellow to survive. First of all, for those that said, we lost Consolidated Freightways, we did okay. We lost Carolina, we did okay. We lost PIE, we did okay. Here's something that they're not considering. Yellow is a $5 million carrier operating in an environment that has a capacity situation that is significantly different than the capacity situation that existed in 2002 and other times. I was talking with the CEO of a large carrier. He said, I don't know if this is true, so please, if it's not true, it's not me. It's the LTL carrier that will forever remain anonymous. There are fewer terminal doors for LTL carriers than existed back when Consolidated Freightways went out of business. And so what all of these analysts are taking a look at, the capacity of flow, how do you run an LTL network without terminals? I personally don't know how you do that. One of the LTL carriers told me, how long did it take them to build their terminal in Southern California? 6 years. So it's not like these carriers can basically say, we'll take all that business, we can handle it because we have trucks. You don't just need trucks. You need a terminal infrastructure. The second thing is, right now, everyone is saying the capacity is not an issue, it'll flow to the other carriers. Well, we are in the midst of a freight recession. Whether we're in an economic recession is open for debate, but we are clearly in a freight recession. And here's a telltale sign. If I look at spot rates in the truckload market, they're down precipitously, right? And people are asking if we reached the floor. But the little secret in the LTL space is the LTL carriers have dropped their rates, but nowhere near the truckload level, and that is because they have done a great job of managing their capacity. They have gotten much better with their assets. Now, for those of you that think, well, that capacity has to go somewhere, I happen to be very good friends with the leaders at Pitt, Ohio. A lot of people thought that when New England Motor Freight went out of business, Pitt, Ohio would be one of the carriers to pick it up. Pitt, Ohio picked up very little of the New England Motor Freight business. And the reason for that was New England Motor Freight had a heavy dose of retail customers. Pitt, Ohio had an industrial base for customers. Different customers, different requirements. So for those shippers that have said, we have to play it safe, here's what you need to get real clear on. First of all, the carriers have much better data today than they did 21 years ago. If you want to talk to an LTL carrier, and if any of you want to say amen, can I get a witness? I'll take it from you. How do you work with your carriers? Take a look at where your freight is flowing, match up your freight with that carrier's network. So if you force an LTL carrier to take business that's out of network, it's going to affect your operating ratio. If it affects your operating ratio, it's going to affect your rates. So for all of these customers, shippers, that are saying flowing capacity will not be an issue, they're also overlooking another key thing, which is why, I happen to be friends with some congressmen. They have validated this. I think I'm right. But Yellow has a rather prominent position in the movement of freight for the Department of Defense and for the government. One LTL carrier says, Mike, here's the problem we all have. No one other than Yellow wants that freight. Now, here's the problem with that. The government can, under certain circumstances, tell you, we are going to get that capacity. We are going to get first call on that capacity. And if that happens, you take that available LTL carrier capacity out there and you shrink it because those LTL carriers have to serve the government. Now, there's another reason why LTL carriers are pulling for Yellow. And that may shock you. Are some of you surprised to hear that? That you have LTL carriers pulling for Yellow. One of them said, Mike, God bless Yellow. And I was like, work with me on this one. Help me understand. He said they have taken the brunt of the attacks by the Teamsters. Do you think the Teamsters are going to say, call it a day if there's no Yellow? No. We're going to get targets painted on our back. And we are going to have to deal with the Teamsters. Now, they expect to prevail in their battle against the Teamsters, but there will be a cost. There will be a potential disruption in their labor base. So these LTL carriers that we have talked to understand what's at stake. Now, for those of you in the room that have LTL freight and have diverted away, let me just share some stuff, because today I was driving in the car and I was talking to the CEO of a fairly large company. He's a YPOer. We were arguably talking about the UPS situation, and I said, Dominic, our recommendation is stay with UPS. Do not go to FedEx right now. We love FedEx. It's nothing against FedEx. But if there is a labor disruption at UPS, we expect it's going to be very brief and very short. And if FedEx is putting in some disconnect language in there that's going to make it onerous if you switch to FedEx. It's not like you're going to switch to FedEx and then when UPS comes back on, give it back to UPS and FedEx is going to say, oh, that's okay, let bygones be bygones. Here's what I'm saying to you, folks. Yellow, we are pulling for Yellow to survive and get through this freight waves-induced panic, as I like to call it, because on the other side of that is a future for shippers with LTL freight is not pretty. We saw that in 2021 and 2022. I had one LTL carrier tell our logistics group, let me make this real simple, so simple that a University of Illinois graduate, even one with a CPA, is going to be able to understand. I said, you now have my full attention. But please say it slowly. He said, we have trucks, you need trucks. We get to charge what we want for you to use our trucks. Shippers in the room, is that not the reality you experienced in 2021, 2022? And folks, what I'm saying to you is, well, Mike, what if I get a couple of pallets lost in the system? What if I can't get my freight back? I'm like, I hate to be so caustic, and Denny will tell you this is why I'll never be an ambassador. Big deal. Your pallets are 5,000, 10,000, so you lost 30, you're eventually going to get it. All the consolidated freight stuff eventually made it to their destinations. It might have taken a little bit longer. But I will guarantee you this, that $20,000 in freight will pale in comparison to the increase in your LTL freight cost that you will experience in a post-Yellow environment. And folks, if you don't get a grip on that, don't say you didn't hear it. You can't plead ignorance. So you have a situation, just to bring it to a close, where we've got the LTL carriers, believe it or not, pulling for Yellow. We have some shippers that recognize what's at stake, and we need to fend off the panic situation. Oh my gosh, what if there's no carriers out there? What am I going to do on the 24th of July? And I think one other thing that I think has to be said. If what I've heard is correct about what's happening in the LTL industry, we are likely, and I get some stuff from different associations with economists, what has me concerned, and I'm fumbling for words, but I think you need to at least consider this. The reemergence of the Teamsters as a force to be reckoned with. It's not to suggest that they weren't always a force to be reckoned with. But we are going to see, I think, a renewed focus on organization activity that could spill over to other carriers and have an effect on what your LTL operations are going to look like over the next 2, 3, 4 years. And here's why I say that. Did any of you read the summary of what's in the T-Force agreement? In the T-Force agreement was language which directly, in my opinion, targeted how Yellow wants to convert some of their drivers to utility drivers. And what I'm saying to you, there are I think the number here is correct, 22,000 Teamsters at Yellow. And the shame of it is, in a world where, we have a driver shortage, the supposition that the Teamsters have made is that they'll just find jobs elsewhere. I don't think that's as realistic as the Teamsters would like to have their members believe. The second thing is the terminals, the docks, et cetera, those associates there, I also don't believe it's a nothing burger like the Teamsters are projecting. And that's why, as you watch this situation with UPS unfold, as ABF and T-Force, I heard somebody say this, and I hope this isn't the case, but, the supposition is ABF and T-Force wouldn't be too upset to see Yellow, something happen with Yellow. And having said that, I suggest that those people take a look at ABF and T-Force and understand how that organization has changed. And going forward, in my opinion, this One Yellow initiative has to be successful. It has to be successful because beyond just liquidity issues now are going to be the issues of how do I invest in the future, because the industry is constantly changing. So having said all that, hopefully this gives you a little bit of clarity about what's at stake and why I hope, and I'll say it publicly as well, I was quoted in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, Paul Berger said there, why I hope somehow, some way, the Teamsters and Yellow come onto the same page and create a viable plan that will allow them to attract the business that is being run off now because of things like the FreightWaves article. So I just want to thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to field any questions.